Friday, September 18, 1925. Arkham, Massachusetts. It is the end of a long and abnormally hot summer. The first hints of autumn beckon, but a heavy heat persists, relentless. A silent, unspoken anger grips the town. Tempers are short, and in the last week alone there have been numerous reports of townspeople coming to heated, violent blows with one another over simple misunderstandings. And now, a call from James Hankerson. He claims to have found a dismembered body in his barn. Blaming the weather would be too easy. There is something wrong with this town. And not a whole lot this old soothsayer can do to stop the slide. My auguries indicate a small group of investigators will soon take note of these strange happenings and set forth to make things right. I'll be watching their progress. But I won't be holding my breath.
Worshipped, so they said, the great old ones who lived ages before there were any men, and who came to the young world at least.
All right, welcome everyone to episode 13 of the Great Old Ones Gaming Podcast. I'm your host, Nate, lost in time and space, and joined with me as always are my fellow co-hosts.
I'm Man from Ling, host of the Whisper in Darkness YouTube channel.
I'm the innkeeper, Vase Odin from the Twisted Tentacle Inn.
And I am Nathan Early, Jester of the Abyss, and basically lurker in the darkness behind these wonderful people.
How you guys all doing this morning?
Amazing.
Guys staying safe?
Oh, yeah. No cabin fever just yet. Lots of gaming to keep us distracted here.
Hey, what you've been playing recently, Vase?
Oh, man, we did 3 sessions of Delta Green, 2 sessions of D&D. I've done 3 sessions of Arkham Horror, the card game, 1 with you, and 2 solo sessions. So
nice.
Lots of gaming getting done this week. What about you guys?
I have been playing, I did my stream of the new investigator decks on last week, and then I've been playing one of those decks, the only one we know the signature weaknesses and assets for, Winifred, and that has been interesting, to say the least. And looking forward to playing her some more.
And what about you, Nathan? How's life at the store been recently?
Well, I mean, obviously with the COVID-19, everybody's world has been turned upside down and shaken a little bit. Basically, the world pulled an insta-fail token. So we're hoping to, do better. We had to shut down the store, and now we're doing curbside only. So there's the fun back and forth of, hey, do you have this thing via email or phone? And then we check the thing, and then we write them back or give suggestions, and then we charge them over the phone and run it out in a bag with the game sanitized and keeping 6-foot distance and say, thanks for supporting our business so we don't go out of business. So, other than that, I have been continuing to, this is going to shock the community for people that know me. I've been continuing to pimp out all of my games that I care about. So I went to Office Depot and I continue to work on my resume paper quality Lord of the Rings book that I'm making for the LCG. I rebound some stuff for Kingdom Death Builder. I got a bunch of fan-made stuff printed off for Arkham Horror, and I did a bunch of stuff for Marvel Champions. So it has been glorious. Oh, and I've just been also pimping out Cthulhu Death May Die with acrylic tokens and special boards that I'm having made. So,
hold on, Nathan, but you're not stuck at home yet. You're still working, right?
I am still quote-unquote working.
So how are you getting all this done and working?
doppelganger? Can we say that? Can
There
I
you
say
go.
that yet? Is that technology come to these humans at this time?
At least a select few.
Yes. Yes. Nate, what have you been up to?
Oh man, so with my job now not existing, I've had a lot of free time. So I started playing a little bit of Darkest Dungeon, which, if you guys aren't familiar, is a turn-based RPG game with a very Lovecraftian vibe. The basic premise of the game is that a rich abbey owner discovers an ancient chamber in his priory, and he hires adventurers to go down and kill the monsters inside. So it has a very rats in the walls type premise, and a lot of the enemies are very Lovecraftian inspired. So I've been starting to play that. I continued playing some Arkham on and off stream. I got smacked around in TFA. So I'm gonna try to redo another campaign of TFA. Hopefully,
Sorry to interrupt, but TFA is the Forgotten Age. Since this is the new player episode, we should
Yes, thank you.
abbreviate. Yeah. Sorry, continue.
So I've been playing that on stream, and I think I'm going to also start a run through Cornerium, which is a PC game inspired by At the Mountains of Madness. So I'm excited to dive into that too. But yeah, why don't we go ahead and dive into tonight's main topic?
We love new players.
We love new players. It's not a cult, Vase.
I just love
love
hearing new
fresh
people
meat.
getting into the game because
But
it's
if
it's a sign that the game is growing.
Did you say fresh people? Is this like people that just use Clearasil?
Fresh.
Hey, also, we don't indoctrinate new players like a cult. But if we did, they could write to Carolyn Fern the botanist at gmail.com to let us know they're new players, and maybe Vase will send them something. Okay, that's all I wanted to say.
Maybe.
There's a chance. Okay,
There's a small, unlikely chance.
there you go.
But yeah, we're all huge fans of the Arkham LCG here on the podcast, and we wanted to start by going into who the Arkham LCG appeals to rather,
Or with. Or
so for me,
somehow.
yeah, or any mixture of those words. Talking is not my strong suit this morning, apparently. But for me, I think fans of or things that appeal to gamers for the Arkham LCG are the deck building aspect of the game, the lore and the flavor behind the game, the RPG elements of the game, as well as the storytelling / legacy elements of the game as well. So if you're a fan of, say, like Magic the Gathering or Pokemon, or even to some lesser extent like Great Western Trail, there's aspects of Arkham that you'll like in the deck building and creative aspect of that. And then obviously if you're a fan of the Arkham Files games or anything Cthulhu related, it's right there in the name, so that's pretty obvious. And then there's also some other mechanics in the game that really lend itself to an RPG type experience with story choices and branching narratives and experience and character classes and all that sort of neat stuff.
Even a little comedy just thrown in.
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
that's true.
Killing a giant bird with a meat cleaver is
Yeah.
great fun.
I was
Yeah.
surprised that you went the Great Western Trail route. I never would have correlated those two. On a storefront level, I say to customers, the thing I say every time is, there's 30,000 games in my store, because it's a giant store, and if they were all to burn to the ground without me being here, except for Arkham Horror, the card game, I would A, be out of a job, and B, be completely happy. And I literally tell that to everybody because it's true. But I tell people that it's a mix of a choose-your-own adventure, because there are definitely choices you make that come back to haunt or save you. It's a escape room, because it has several times where you kind of have to find hidden tricks or decode things or whatever. You kind of know what I'm talking about. It has a thick RPG element, like you mentioned. which, by the way, side note, Vase, Nate, I've been loving that Delta Green 3-part thing that you did. So good. Oh my God. That is so entertaining.
It's true. Nathan texts me randomly telling me, we did a playthrough of Delta Green for those who are not familiar with those episodes. We did a 3-episode playthrough of a Delta Green scenario, and Nathan texts me at random times in the day laughing or making a comment about a specific situation.
Nate, I wouldn't do that, would I?
No.
I may or may not have received similar messages.
What about a phone call warning your wife that you're going to break down the doors in the house?
That may or may not have also happened. I will plead the fifth on
Wow,
that
you
one.
are like an FBI agent. Just very well done. So, role-playing aspect to the game that's very atmospheric, along with the choose your own adventure escape room. It does tickle the same itch that Magic players get to scratch, where you have so many cards and you have so many options on how to build a deck. And that's where people can watch any of your YouTube sites to kind of find out more about the how and the why you do that. And then finally, the cooperative aspect, the fact that when you do the adventure, you have this rich story that's exciting and slightly terrifying, with a lot of choices and replay that you're sharing with your partner, your friends, bonding with strangers. It has everything. So anyway, sorry, I wanted to make sure that I said what I say to everybody.
I agree with you on that social thing. Like, I mostly play Arkham solo, but it is definitely quite a different experience when you get to play with other people. That camaraderie, because it is a co-op game. You know, when you pull a token that helps you succeed on something where you had a very long shot to succeed on, everybody cheers at the same time. It really brings you guys together. Or when you pull that auto fail and, just it's a miserable defeat, it's still hilarious and everybody gets to have a good time about just how crazy the situation was. So the social aspect of it is definitely something that I really appreciate, even though I don't get to experience it as often. But I do enjoy the game solo as a completely different type of thing too.
Absolutely, and we also have with us a solo expert / Octagon expert, Man from Lang, who has done, if you haven't seen it yet, Whisper in the Darkness is really awesome. You get to watch all the plays go through, you get to hear the metagame. But what would you say as far as solo play or Octagon play, Man from Lang?
Well, I think the thing that attracted me to the game, I mean, I've played most of the Arkham Files games at this point, and I think the narrative of the game is one of its strong suits. If you've ever read any of Lovecraft's stories or his or related authors, I mean, you're basically playing out those stories with a great deal of replayability. Mechanically, I think the game, like most of the Arkham Files games, is at its heart, it's a race. And you are trying to go as fast as feasibly possible to complete the scenario before the scenario defeats you. And so the quicker you go, often the better off you are, because the weight of the weight of the game will crush you if you take too much time.
That's definitely a good way of looking at it.
But it's very well balanced for both solo and multiplayer play. I know Vase and I play mostly solo. And there's different deck building choices depending on which format you're playing in. If you're playing in solo, you need to build decks that are a little more decks that can do everything well. Whereas once you get into the multiplayer format, you can specialize a lot more and focus on one aspect of the game, one or two aspects, whether that be fighting or gathering clues or evading enemies, and do that do that one thing really, really well. Whereas if you were to do that in solo, you would not fare quite as well.
The next question would be, okay, you're a new player. Some jerk at a game store or some friend from Red Deer or a cook or maybe even a telephone salesperson. Somebody gets you to play this game because they say it's amazing, blah, 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 you got to buy it. So you buy the core game, you have the core game, you try it, you like it. What should be your very next step? Should it be to get a second core set? Should it be to get a certain scenario, a standalone?
So personally, I bought 2 core sets after learning of the, I guess, issue, or not really issue, but they really only intended it to be for 2 players. And I originally brought it to my game group of 4 players and realized the folly when I only purchased 1 copy on Amazon. So I ran down to my local game store, and thankfully they had a second copy.
Everybody watching me play.
Yeah, so I think if you're playing with a group of players, it's necessary that you buy a second core box. And even if you're playing by yourself, having 2 copies of really a lot of the game's essential staples for player cards, makes deck building that much more robust and a richer experience, in my opinion. And then later on, once you start to buy more deluxe boxes, you'll have extra copies of encounter cards from the core set that you can quickly swap in and out of particular scenarios that you may enjoy playing over and over again. But what do you guys think?
I was going to say, Vase, what do you think about the question of what to buy next? Do you think people should jump at a second core set before a deluxe expansion?
Yeah, I still think a second core set should be your first purchase. That may change with the new investigator decks that have been announced, but that's for another time. But as of right now, yeah, I think a second core set is integral. Like Nate said, a lot of staple cards. The core set only comes with 1 copy of each card. Am I right on that? Can someone double check me on that? I think
it comes with like 2 copies of some of the neutral cards, but
cards,
of all the class cards, it only comes with 1 copy.
1 copy, which, if anyone who is new to the game has not played a card game or a deck building type game, having 1 copy of a card in a 30-card deck is usually not a good idea if you want to see it consistently throughout your game. So you want to have the 2 copies of specific cards that you really want your deck to be built around. So having that second core set will enable you to do that. Plus, it'll enable you to make multiple decks if you're playing multiplayer and that kind of stuff. So, yeah, I still think a second core set is very important.
Sure. To be fair, this breaks the rule of when you play the game and upgrade a card and add it to your deck, then you won't see it. Like, I just spent 5 experience on this, and then you just never draw it. Because, of course not.
That can happen, but...
Man from Lang. Going back to you, do you think a second core set is the first thing someone should get when they start to get serious, or would you recommend a standalone or an deluxe box?
I think it's a little more complicated now that the game has been going on for as long as it has. I think initially a second core set was the obvious choice, but now I think that the game has grown. If you have a particular class that you're interested in playing, you may want to look at a different product. And because you do get the full play set of cards, it's a little bit tricky because a lot of the cards are spread out over different Mythos packs, and while there's this temptation, and I mean, to play everything sort of in, you buy your core set, then you pick up Dunwich and play through that, and then you play everything sequentially. Like if you're playing, say, if you really like the Mystic class, picking up another core set is a good idea, but then you also want to look at some of the other packs because they have really good Mystic cards in them. and those packs aren't necessarily in deluxe boxes, or if you were to play sequentially, it would be some time before you actually picked up those cards.
Yeah, very good point.
So I think you do need to sort of consider, if there's a particular class that you enjoy playing, then you may want to find out what the good cards are, and then seek out the packs that those cards are in. If you're on a limited budget, that is.
Nathan, what are your thoughts? And do you think there are pros and cons to both buying a second core set as your next purchase versus buying a deluxe expansion?
Well, and I battle this every single day, right? Because I sell at my game store when we have it, and I have people order 20 to 40 copies of the core game because we sell so much. But I want players, or I want customers to feel like it's not just a cash grab. Like, I want them to be happy. So I say, try the game. Here's the core set. Here's some websites. Here's several podcasts that I recommend. And I'm glad to point this episode out to newer players now, because that is the point of what we're doing today. But I tell them, when you're ready to get a second core set, in this box, you will get one machete. Now, taboo list aside, you ideally want 2 machetes if you play a Guardian. In this box, you'll get a Shriveling. If you play a Mystic, you probably want 2 Shrivelings. And these are just general things I tell people. But if we have them, I do recommend standalones. Guardians of the Abyss, Carnival of Horrors, Curse of the Rougarou, even the new Murder at the Excelsior. All great options if people are on a budget or they just want to get more content, especially if they're solo players, right? But when they want to ratchet it up the next step, and they want to, like you said, see those cards more, have more consistency, build better decks, definitely play with more players, then I would definitely recommend the core set, second core set. And I think Man from Lang touched on it, if I remember correctly, but instead of going the standard Dunwich next, oftentimes we won't have the exact ones in stock that I want to show. So what I'll do is I'll ask people if they want a challenge, because then I'd say the Forgotten Age. If they want a certain type, like, hey, do you like witches? Do you like tarot? Do you like kind of, a lot of people have been going with Dream Eaters because they like that concept of otherworldly, that kind of darker Oz, Alice in Wonderland experience where you go to the other realm. If I had my druthers, I would show Path to Carcosa to everybody, but oftentimes we don't have it in stock. So ultimately, I've got to feel the customers out, player out, but always start with the base. Maybe get a second one if you start to get serious. I do like to push the deluxe for more more investigator options. When I say, hey, if you get this box, you can have 5 new investigator choices. Boom, you double the game's excitement instantly, right? But with the new investigator starter decks coming out, I think that'll get veterans excited because they get new content, and I think that'll be a good way to segue. Is that the right word? No. To entice newer players to jump in when there's been a lot of content.
But I think that's also where, it's very helpful if you have a community that can support you, because say if you go to pick up another, I think we all know that not all investigators are created equal, and so if there is a particular investigator that you like, go for it. But if it really sort of depends, if you've got a group to play with, then certain investigators are going to be better than others. And then if you're playing solo, you sort of have to pick and choose which investigator that you want to specialize in. So if you pick up a deluxe expansion thinking all 5 of these investigators are going to be equally good at the format that I'm playing at, you may end up disappointed and somewhat frustrated. So if you've got a group that can sort of steer you in the right direction and say, hey, maybe you don't want to play Skids solo, but Skids in multiplayer is fine, then that's helpful. And there's a lot of resources out there that can point you in those directions. Just like when I was saying, if there's a particular class you want, you sort of need to know which cards work best in that class before you just run out and buy a bunch of Mythos packs to get just because they have, say, Mystic cards or whatnot in them. You want to target the
right. Good use. Target is a very strong word. Instead of just bulk buy, get everything. Yeah. And then I like how you mentioned Finn. You're like, yeah, hey, check Finn out. Oh, look at that willpower. It's pretty bad, huh? Well, hey, there's also, did I say Finn?
You said Finn, yeah.
Skids, yeah. Skids, look at that willpower. And then you're like, wait a second. Check Finn out. And you're like, hold my Earl Grey. Check out Calvin. And then just make people be like, what? I mean, that's just that. It actually kind of makes Skids look strong.
Yeah, I think there's that initial shock when you get the core set and you're looking at the investigators and you see someone like Wendy who has a woeful combat score, or Skids who has a woeful willpower score, and you wonder to yourself, how could I ever play an investigator like this? And in a core set only format, you're probably right. Some of those investigators are more challenging to play than ones with a more balanced stat line. But in the case of somebody like Wendy, or not Wendy, but Daisy, she gets a lot better once you purchase a few packs from the Dunwich Legacy, say. And Agnes, there's a lot of the Dunwich Legacy is a real gold mine for Mystic cards.
So it's kind of interesting that you say that you wouldn't buy products necessarily sequentially, because I kind of did the opposite experience when I first got into the game. I bought 2 core sets, and then I bought a deluxe expansion, and then I liked it, but I was more interested in developing the roster of investigators, so I ended up purchasing the other deluxe expansions first. So I was curious what you guys think about buying all the deluxe boxes versus buying like a whole campaign's worth at a time.
Huh. That's a good way to go about it. I never thought of doing that. It gets you a bunch more investigators that you can play with, and the deluxe box has more player cards than a typical Mythos pack. So you're definitely doing yourself a favor if that's your goal. Is deck building is, one of the more important things versus running through a story episodically. So if deck building is extremely important, then that is a good way to go about it, I think. That's something I hadn't thought about.
Yeah, and I think the scenarios in the deluxe boxes tend to be some of the stronger scenarios in every campaign. They're the scenarios that I go back to probably more often than, say, the 6th Mythos pack of a particular cycle. I seem to rarely get to play those ones, but the scenarios in the deluxe box I'll play over and over and over again. So you really get a lot of good value from the deluxe boxes.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. The deluxe, I think every expansion, one or both of the scenarios in the deluxe boxes are my favorites from that expansion, or at least close to my favorites.
Mm-hmm. And not only that too, but the player cards in the deluxe expansions are usually catered towards the investigators that are included in the box too. So you end up getting a lot of the staples, like for that particular investigator. Like for instance, in the Circle Undone, there's a lot of cards that are kind of specifically geared towards the rogue investigator Preston, whose whole thing is acquiring a bunch of money and leveraging that money to boost his woeful stats, to put it in Manful Lang's words.
So typical for the current political environment.
Just throw money at it. Hope it sticks.
Man from Lang touched on the deluxe boxes and getting a lot of value out of the specific scenarios. And I think I just briefly want to touch on that because new players, a very common question is, how's the replay value of the game? What do you guys think in terms of replay value, especially those who just buy a second core set and only have those 3 scenarios, or buy a couple of deluxe boxes and only have 2 scenarios from each? What are your thoughts on replay value for new players?
I think it kind of depends on how you, what you're looking to get out of the game. If you're looking to, finish the story of a particular campaign, then just having the deluxe box isn't really gonna satiate your appetite. But if you're just looking to experiment with particular investigators and scenarios, then having a lot of options available to you in that regard is going to feel very rewarding. So it kind of depends on what you're looking to get out of the experience. But I would say overall that, I think there's a lot of replayability just in the 2 scenarios you get in a particular deluxe expansion.
Yeah, I think it depends a lot on what you want out of the game. I know some people get into the game because they want the story, and so the only way to really finish the story is to pick up a deluxe box and all of the mythos packs for that particular campaign. Whereas I think as myself goes, I sort of, as much as I like the story, the scenarios I enjoy the most, I enjoy them from a mechanical standpoint, and I want to play them over and over again because I think they're mechanically sound. So for a while, I tended to play a lot more standalone, where I would basically cherry pick the scenarios that I enjoyed, and I would rarely play a campaign because it's a little more time consuming. So during the Dunwich Legacy, say, I really liked Blood on the Altar, so I played that a ton. Whereas Undimensioned and Unseen, I've played a lot less. So I think there's sort of there's this, because the way the game is structured, there's a temptation to say, okay, I've picked up the Dunwich Legacy, so now I have to pick up all 6 Mythos packs. And I don't think that's necessarily that you have to do that. I think you can pick and choose the ones that you want to play, and then if you're, especially in these times, if you're short on cash and can't afford to, say, drop, I don't know what an entire campaign would be worth, but more than $100, I think.
It's like 120, something like that.
Pick up one scenario that you're going to get a lot of replay value out of, I think would be a better choice than.
Yeah, I find myself kind of doing the same thing that you said, Man from Lang. But maybe that's just because I've played all the scenarios and have experienced them blind. But yeah, I tend to play a lot more standalone and just kind of cherry pick the scenarios I really like to play a lot from a mechanical perspective. So I think, it depends on, like you said, what you're going for in an experience. But on to that point, what do you guys think about the return to boxes as far as new players purchasing a return to box? So say if you purchased all of Dunwich or all of Carcosa and you really like that particular campaign, would you recommend that player purchase the return to box for said campaign, or would you recommend that they use that investment elsewhere?
Nathan.
Nice. Well, I mean, I think the only problem with this discussion line is this assumes that everything's available. Like you look on the Facebook group, and right now I'm looking at an example here 17 minutes ago, trying to find Path to Carcosa full cycle, can't find it anywhere, can anyone help? So, I mean, sometimes it's not a matter of what exactly you can get so much as what you can find, right? If we're at a low point, like after the holidays, or I don't know, during a pandemic where all the factories have shut down and the places stopped shipping. And I have a brand new player who's like, hey, I'm really enjoying this game. You don't have a lot of product on the shelf. And I have a return to the Night of the Zealot, and they've got the core box. I'm like, try the Night of the Zealot. There's choices to make on how to make it harder or easier, but it will give you additional content. It will let you play these differently, So that's kind of a toss-up for me, on what to get. I do like the return to boxes. I don't really care about the extra player cards personally. I just like the extra content and the chance to go back and fix quote-unquote stuff. What they did with Undimensioned and Unseen was great, and I like what they did with the beginning box. And there's no blowgun coming out for Return to the Forgotten Age. Otherwise, they'd be really excited. But
can you explain a little bit for the new players what the return to boxes actually are, or what they do in anyone?
Yeah, so a return to box, I guess they can make it more difficult, but they don't always. It's kind of like some of the Nightmare decks for Lord of the Rings. Simply put, when you get a return to box, the first and foremost thing you're getting storage, right? You get a nice sturdy box that has a cool graphic on the end, like a card catalog, and it comes with inserts for the different sets within that deluxe for the different what do you call them? Not factions, but encounter sets. You're also going to get upgraded player cards. Oftentimes, they're going to take cards that aren't that popular and give you kind of better versions of them, different versions of them. Sometimes they'll pick a few cards that are a little more popular. You're also going to get more content for the entire cycle. So for Return to the Night of the Zealot, sure, you've got your first 3 adventures you're getting upgraded. But with Dunwich, you're getting all 8, 2 in the main box and then the 6 additional with little bits here and there. Sometimes it's something very minor, a few location cards. Sometimes they've gone back and reworked the mechanics of something. Overall, it's just more content is better because it gives more choices. But I'm a pretty big fan.
But you pretty much have to have the deluxe or the entire campaign or whatnot in order for the return to box to actually be useful in terms of that. So you're not getting a full scenario in the return to box. You're basically.
But once again, supply and demand. If everything is out, if something's really hard to get, and you have the return to box, A, you're going to have that storage for when you do get stuff. B, you're going to be supporting the hobby, which is, if you like the game, you're going to want to support it with sales. But also, you're going to have the return to for the stuff you have. If I have Path to Carcosa and the first couple scenarios, and I've played them and I'm digging them, but I don't want to do, or I can't do all of them, I can use that return to box to go back and replay those and experience them a little differently.
What are your thoughts, man, from relying on the return to boxes?
I'm sort of torn on them. I mean, I like coming from Lord of the Rings LCG, where the Nightmare decks were, if you really enjoyed a scenario, you could jump in and play a harder version of that scenario. The return to boxes they're nice that they have the player cards, although I wouldn't consider the player cards essential. I think with the exception of maybe Return to the Night of the Zealot, I think they're probably one of the last purchases you would want to make. While they do change up the scenarios a little bit, there's also a chance that you won't see any of the new cards, so you could play a scenario and it would be basically the same. I don't think they changed them up dramatically. They tweak them here and there, but I think that the Return to the Night of the Zealot box is a good one just because it does turn the gathering from a very intro scenario into a full-fledged scenario, so you're really getting something that you can play repeatedly. And then Midnight Masks is a very solid scenario, as is the Devourer Below. So it's sort of, if you've just got the core box, you're really transforming that first scenario into something a little more meaty. But I think if you don't have, say, a full cycle of something, you're not going to get as much value from a return to box as, say, if you went and purchased a Mythos pack from another campaign.
And Man from Lang, while we're kind of on the subject of a particular scenario, what about standalones? Would you recommend somebody pick up a standalone before they pick up a return to box?
I don't really play the standalones a lot. So I mean, I enjoy them, but I think there's, I guess I like a lot of the Mythos pack scenarios more than I like the standalones. Like I think back in the core set days when you basically had the core set, and the Dunwich Legacy box, and then Curse of the Rougarou was the only standalone available. People were so hungry for content that people were really wanted to pick up Curse and play it a lot because there weren't many options besides the core set scenarios to play with. And but I don't really play the standalones all that often. So
yeah, no, I totally agree, because you're right. Yeah, when the game first came out, it was like Curse, Carnival, back to the core, Curse, Carnival. I would like to point out that I think one reason I don't mind the standalones is because I like a lot of the fan-made content. So if anyone wants to do any fan-made content and have it printed off either at home or like Office Depot or Kinko's, ArkhamCentral.com has like 30 plus adventures that, like you were saying, are standalone-esque. There are a few campaigns, but it's mostly a one-time experience. But it also has really good links for new players to check out where to get bags made, where to get special mats made, blogs, podcasts like ours, etc. There's a lot going on for newer players on that site too. So use that as a resource. Speaking of resources, there's also Vase. You mentioned the FFG tutorial. Do you want to cover that real quick?
Yeah, on YouTube, and we'll link it in the show notes. But Fantasy Flight Games, the makers of Arkham Horror, made a video tutorial for Arkham Horror, the card game, and it's fantastic. The narrator is very dramatic, so he's very entertaining to listen to. But it's very easy to follow, very easy to understand. The tutorial is what I use to learn the game, because you read through the instructions, but you always make mistakes on some of the rules, and certain things come up where you're like, oh, how did that work? And then you read through it and you're like, I still don't get it. So that FFD tutorial is fantastic. It kind of lets you go through the entire setup, through the gathering, and how combat works, how deck building works. I mean, it's really fantastic. So I highly recommend anyone who's brand new to the game to check out that tutorial. And it's not very long either. It's I think it's 20 minutes if I'm right. I could be completely wrong on that, but for what it is, it's not a very long video. You can sit through it and learn the game along with it while you're playing, and it's really going to show you the ropes for the basics. But then once you've kind of gotten a grasp of the basics, there's plenty of other content creators and such, Man from Lang and Lost in Time and Space, where they'll show you like different rules, clarifications, and different cards and how they work and things like that. So once you've learned the game, just do your own research on YouTube and podcasts and all that. There's a lot of great ones from the community.
I think one of the important things for new players is the way the rule book is structured. There is a learn to play guide and then a rules reference. And I think the learn to play guide is helpful in learning the game because they simplify it, and and streamline it quite a bit. But the quicker that you can make the jump to the rules reference, I think the better off you'll be, because the rules reference really gets into the meat of the game and provides a lot of the insight into the sort of tips and tricks that you can do that aren't really included in the core set. Or sorry, not the core set, but the learn to play rules.
Yeah, but it's not a cover to cover type reading, right? It's like
No. The rules reference is more if there's a particular topic that you're interested in, say, how do enemies function, or how do I advance the act deck and stuff like that, then the rules reference is helpful in clarifying a lot of those questions that you may have. I think there's one example that I always come back to is the like which cards can you trigger, and if you read the learn to play guide, it's usually like, well, your own cards obviously, but then once you get into the rules reference, it turns out, well, you can actually trigger cards controlled by other players on occasion, and sometimes it's very beneficial to do that. But and the rules reference really goes into when you can do that and which cards you can do that with.
Yeah, and on that note too, the FAQ on FFG's website is also a great resource for newer players. It goes over some of the funky card interactions and clarifies some of the additional rules. So now that we've gone over what a new player should purchase when first getting into the game, why don't we actually talk about playing the game itself? So there are 5 main classes of investigator in the Arkham LCG. Why don't we go ahead and take some time to kind of go over the basics of what each of these classes do and what they're looking to accomplish when playing the game.
We'll start with Nate with the survivors. What do survivors do?
So the survivor class is kind of the odd man out, so to speak. While a lot of the other classes have a particular stat that they're focused on, the survivor class is the class that's all about making the most out of a bad situation. So they're all about making the best of failure with cards like Take Heart or I'm losing blanks on fail cards, but basically their whole idea is that they're going to try to make the most of a bad situation. So Wendy, for instance, is really good at making sure that she passes the test that she needs to pass and is okay with failing everything else. Her special ability, for instance, lets her discard a card from her hand to draw a new token when she makes a test, and there are also other investigators that deal with discarding cards from your hand, like Ashcan Pete from the Dunwich Legacy, who's all about using his special ally Duke to do most of the heavy lifting for him. So they're kind of a strange amalgamation of janky sort of stuff. They're also involved with recursion. Yorick from the Path to Carcosa likes to get assets into his discard pile and then defeat enemies and recover them from the discard pile. So they're all about that as well. But why don't we talk about the Guardian class, the class that's most known for killing enemies?
Right. Well, I mean, and that's a good point. I do love Wendy's dexterity. That's something that playing a lot of Guardians I don't often get to utilize. So two of the main things that the game tends to focus on, especially for newer players, is the investigating and the fighting. And Guardians excel at the fighting, sometimes the investigating. So their fighting stat tends to be pretty high, around a 4 in most cases. And And that's nice because there's always going to be some type of monster somewhere. So they are going to kind of come up, whether that be one of the weaknesses that's haunting you. What is it? Stubborn Detective or the Silver Twilight Acolyte. Or in a lot of cases, there's going to be a lot of creatures coming at you. Roland Banks, that comes in the core set, has a decent intelligence, which is great for investigating. But of course, his fight power is a 4. And several of his abilities trigger off of defeating creatures. For example, using the evidence card, he gets clues when he defeats an enemy at a location. Guardians are pretty straightforward in general to play. So if you have people that are not that comfortable with the game or are just trying to feel things out, Guardians and Seekers tend to be a pretty safe bet to go with. Whereas, Mystics that Man from Lang will get into soon tend to require more. And like you were saying, Survivors being the odd person out, you've kind of got to figure out the beat to play those with. But yeah, nice safe chance. They can soak some damage. They tend to be a little weaker when it comes to willpower, sanity. So you are going to want to watch out for grabbing things like an Elder Sign upgrade or having several allies out later with Charisma, but initially they can take some soak because it is a little easier, I think, to go insane on a Guardian compared to other classes. Vase, do you want to go ahead and cover Seekers?
So the Seeker class is the one that picks up all the clues. They're great at investigating in general. Daisy, the Seeker that comes in the core set, has an investigate value of 5, which is extremely high and really powerful. The Seeker class specializes in picking up clues, drawing cards. They're really good at drawing cards and searching through decks. So it really fits into this theme of like research and so on. The card pool, as you get more sets, it expands into some really cool ideas. So it keeps the Seekers from being boring. There's cards that kind of fit into this investigative or like research role where you'll get a card that's kind of cryptic where you'll have to discover the runes. It's kind of like a mini mission. And when you do, then you get access to more powerful cards or, discover the formula, things like that. So if you like having like a mini game within the game, the Seeker class is also pretty cool at doing that. It keeps them interesting because there are times where you won't be investigating. And since Seekers are generally not good at combat, you're going to need something else to do when you're not fighting or when you're not looking for clues. Playing solo, I think a Seeker, they do tend to struggle a little bit. They're great at advancing the act and the agenda and winning you the game very quickly. But if you're stuck with an enemy, generally it's the end of you right there. But in a multiplayer game, you can really specialize in that, and you can literally be the difference between winning the game for your group or losing very badly. In a solo game, you really have to be careful about how you build a Seeker, look really into their card pool, what access they have to other card pools in order to kind of mitigate that big weakness of not being able to handle a creature. So the Mystic class, if you're interested in searching through decks, card draw, helping the team advance the act without fighting creatures, then this is the class that you'd want to be playing.
Man from Lang, tell us a little bit about Mystics.
Well, the Mystic class is for those out there, if you really enjoy throwing spells around, then you may want to consider the Mystic class. They tend to have very high willpower, and they use that willpower to investigate, fight, and evade, usually using other cards in combination with their high willpower. They tend to have a little bit lower intellect, sort of average to below average intellect, so they're not great at discovering clues, but that's what willpower is for. The same goes for their combat and agility. Both tend to be fairly average as well. They, for the most part, have lower health and high sanity, so they can take a lot of horror, which is often some of their cards inflict horror on themselves, which they can use for, in the case of Agnes, to deal additional damage. Mystics tend to be a little bit slower than the other classes because they have... because they need, in addition to their willpower, they usually use other cards to achieve that. So if you don't draw the cards that you need, say, it can be a little more difficult for them to investigate. So they can be a little bit slower. They can also be a little bit hard up for resources, which you use to pay for the cards, because many of their cards are quite expensive. So as you're playing, it can be you have to make some choices about which how you spend those resources to get the biggest bang for your buck. The other main component of, besides spells, is chaos bag manipulation. So if you enjoy playing around with the odds of the game, then the Mystic class is one for you, because they have both investigators and a bunch of cards that help you change the odds.
And I tell people it's like a lock. There's several tumblers in a lock before it opens, and Mystics are kind of like that. In order to kind of stabilize, like you were saying, you just have to wait for the pieces to fall into place. And it can be a frustrating game, especially telling newer players, don't get too frustrated, because there's going to be some games where you just can't stabilize before you get thwacked.
Yeah, I think they require a little more patience to get the most out of. And there will be games where you simply don't draw the cards that you need in order to get going. I think they've gotten better. They've certainly gotten better over the years, and it used to be, say, Mystics had one card that they could use to fight with, and now they have plenty of those. So it's gotten a bit easier to build a Mystic deck these days.
And then the final class is the Rogue class, and they're the class all about money. So they like to accumulate tons of resources with cards like Hot Streak or investments from the Circle Undone, and they use this money to generate some sort of advantage, whether it's with Skids and his ability to spend 2 resources to gain additional actions, or if it's with Preston and his family inheritance, which gains him a bunch of resources every single turn that he can use for a card like Well Connected, which lets you, or rather, it gives you a huge boost depending on how many resources you have. They also have cards that deal with evasion. That's their primary stat, is the evasion stat, or the agility stat rather. So rogues are particularly good at dodging enemies and accumulating resources with that, with cards like Watch This or Slip Away, which are great options. And they're also pretty good at getting clues with cards like Lockpicks or Intel Report. So they can fill sort of a generalist role in your multiplayer group. And as far as playing rogues solo, it's a bit of a varied experience depending on which investigator you go with. But
and what cards you pick.
Yeah, and what cards you pick. But rogues are generally very flashy investigators. They're all about, as I said earlier, generating resources, evading enemies, and then they're also, I would call, the combo class, as they have a lot of...
The combo class, that's what I was going to say, yeah.
Yeah, they have a lot of cards that that can do huge things depending on whether or not you succeed a particular test. They also have this mini mechanic with succeeding by 2 or more, or the over-succeed mechanic. So a lot of their cards will gain additional benefits depending on whether or not you over-succeed a test, whether it's a card like Quick Thinking that gives you an additional action, or I think it's Pickpocketing. After you evade an enemy by 2 or more, you get to draw a card and gain 2 resources. So if you like being slippery and pickpocketing enemies and helping your team get clues, then the rogue class is for you. So now that we've covered all of the major classes of the game, what are some general guidelines you guys tend to gravitate towards when building a deck for the Arkham LCG?
So when I deck build, generally I'll like start just picking cards from the investigator's card pool that I think would be helpful. No, I take that back. First, I come up with a concept. So if I want, let's say, to build a Carolyn Fern deck, and I want to make it a, willpower, go spell slinging type of deck. Now that I've decided on that, then I'll just start adding cards into the deck that I think would fit into that theme or into, that type of deck that I'm building. And then as I'm adding cards, I'll usually notice that I have like 50 or 60 cards, so that's too much. So then I'll start removing cards that are non-essential, or if there are cards that kind of do the same thing, but one does it better, or generally I feel will be better in more situations, then I'll take out the one that is less important, and I'll start trimming the deck down that way. And as I'm doing that, I'm keeping an eye on balance in terms of slots. So like accessory slot, hand slot, body slot. You don't want to put too many cards that are hand slot cards, let's say, because then chances are you're going to always have certain cards in your hand that you can't play because your hand slots are already taken. So I keep an eye on that, keep those to a minimum. I keep an eye on the number of resources that each card costs. So as I'm cutting down cards, ArkhamDB.com is a great resource for this because it gives you a quick reference as to what your average cost is for your cards and such. You want to keep your card cost low because, again, you'll be stuck with a hand of cards that you can't play if you pick cards that are really good but just too expensive that you just won't have enough resources for. So I keep all that into consideration and then eventually trim it down to 30. I'll test play the deck. Once I test play it, then I know what needs to be tweaked, and then I'll swap in and out based on that. I know everyone does their deck building different, so I'm curious to hear how you guys do yours.
I generally tend to, I'll pick an investigator, and then from there, it depends on the campaign that I'm playing, but generally speaking, I tend to build my decks with the investigator's main ability in mind. So, for instance, if I'm building an Ashcan Pete deck, for instance, I tend to focus most of my deck building strategy around his ability to be able to discard a card and get a benefit from it. So there are numerous ways that you could go about doing that, but generally speaking, I like to have that one kind of core idea in mind, and then from there, whether I'm playing solo or multiplayer, I'll add various assets and skills and events into the deck. If I'm playing solo, for instance, I'll try to balance my ability to combat enemies and gather clues through investigation, more half and half. Or if I'm playing multiplayer, I'll tend to focus, more in one direction over the other. And and then from there, you just, like Vase said, you want to make sure that your resource cost is low overall in your deck, so that you're not bloated with a bunch of cards that you can't use. And same goes for slot management as well, since your investigator only has so many slots that they can fill. You don't want to be overburdened with cards that you can't play in your hand. Another thing that I'll consider too is the amount of skill icons that are in my deck. I want to make sure that I have enough skill icons that I can deal with certain threats that the encounter deck will present. A lot of investigators tend to be particularly bad either at willpower or agility, or in some instances both. And you need a way to deal with the encounter deck too. So that's also something that I consider when building my deck. And it's funny that you mentioned, Vase, that you're the type of person that like gathers a whole bunch of cards and then trims them down, where I'm kind of the opposite, where I tend to be very frugal with what goes into the deck in the first place. Nathan, what about you? How do you tend to go about building your decks?
Well, mine's very simple. I don't often build decks. I go to ArkhamDB. Quite simply, the deck building aspect for me, I can do it because I played Magic for 20 plus years, but I don't really enjoy the deck building aspect as much as some people do. So I don't spend my energy doing that. I spend my energy creating terrain and setups, reading the story, doing fan-made content, and engaging with the community. So ArkhamDB all the way. There are thousands at this point, I think, great decks up on there. Sometimes I'll tweak some of them, but yeah, that's my default.
And Man from Lang, I know you're a big proponent of gathering decks from ArkhamDB and using them on stream as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think ArkhamDB is a great resource if you're just looking for a deck to play or just some ideas. There tends to be a lot of untested decks up there, so you sort of have to be careful about what you pick and choose. I think one of the important things to mention is that if you're in a core set only environment, there isn't a lot of deck building to be done because of the limited card pool that you'll have. You pretty much just take all the Guardian cards in the box, and say if you're playing Roland, who is the Guardian Investigator in the core set, you basically take all of the Guardian cards and all of the Seeker cards and mash them together, and that is your deck. And if you buy a second core set, then you can start to do a little bit more deck building by, say, removing some of the cards that aren't performing quite as well and replacing them with second copies of the cards that you want. And that goes for pretty much all of the investigators in the core set. There's not a great deal of varying strategies that you can do when you're deck building. When I deck build, I tend to focus on a few key things. The first is, how am I going to investigate as a solo? Since I play predominantly solo, I like to have, the first thing I'll do is I'll go through and pick out how I'm going to gather clues, because you can't win unless you gather clues effectively and efficiently. And sometimes that just means your investigator has a high intellect, say Daisy with her 5. You don't have to really add a lot of cards to bolster that. So cards that both get you clues, get you multiple clues, stuff like that. Then I look at how I'm going to gain resources. You get a resource every turn during the upkeep, but most decks need to generate additional resources in order to function well. So I'll go through and pick cards, pick the ways that I'm going to generate those additional resources so I can afford to play the cards that I want. Then I'll look at something like card draw. You do get a card during the upkeep phase, but drawing additional cards is always good in cards that... So packing extra card draw is very helpful because it will get you the cards you need faster. So I tend to look at investigate. How am I going to investigate? How am I going to generate resources? How am I going to draw additional cards? And then I usually will pick, say, how I'm going to fight enemies or how I'm going to evade enemies, and focus on one of those. And then so adding combat cards after that.
And I do apologize. I didn't mean to be arbitrary with my answer, just honest, but very quickly, based on what Cameron said, based on what Vase has said, etc., I have tended to focus on the character's main strength. So look at their ability, look at their Elder Sign ability, look at their key, most important stat, and build around that. And also, there's so many cards out there. If you're a newer player, you're not going to have the options. If you start to build your card pool, decide if you want to have someone who does a special function that's just a supporting character. Look at your icons. Look at your cost to your curve. Once again, players that come in from a Magic perspective will have that advantage. But just playing the game, testing decks out, you can become an expert from 0 to 60 pretty quickly. So anyway, I just wanted to add that addendum.
Yeah, and how you build your deck will also depend on, the campaign you're playing, the difficulty you're playing at, and as well as the player count. Moving on from deck building itself, what are some general gameplay guidelines that you would give to a new player? I know for me, I would state that if you're playing multiplayer, like Man from Lang said earlier, you can actually deal with threat cards in your fellow investigators' threat area, for instance. And generally, I would tell them that you want to prioritize getting clues, managing enemies, and then from there dealing with whatever particular gimmick that the scenario is presenting you. Like, for instance, in the Gathering, there's a lot of ghoul enemies and willpower tests, so you generally want to have willpower icons in your deck, and you generally want to make sure that you pass particular investigate checks, etc., etc. And then from there, if you're looking for a more casual experience, I would tell you to play on an easier difficulty, and if you're wanting more of a challenge, to play on a harder difficulty. And I would also say to that new player that you're gonna lose. It's gonna be a tough go if you decide to play at a higher difficulty, and that's okay. That it's not out of the ordinary for you to absolutely get crushed, say, in your first instance of the Gathering. But what are some general guidelines that you guys would give to newer players?
For me, I think it's very easy to try and take a test and try to conserve cards in your hand, even if you know that your chances of making the test are pretty slim. So I think it's a mistake that I still make quite a bit myself, but being able to control yourself and not take tests unnecessarily, because failing tests can be pretty detrimental to your advancement or your, what's the word I'm looking for? Your tempo in the game. If you can't pass a test, you need to draw cards so you can get a card that's going to give you the icons you need to improve your chances to pass that test. You'll spend less actions doing that than you would keeping on that test and failing over and over and over. I had a game in the Forgotten Age where my first attempt at investigating, it was like round 1, and it took me 3 rounds. It was like, I don't know, almost 7 failures in a row to pick up one clue, and it was just brutal. I had to start over. Super bad. So it really can mess with you and make you think, well, it's an even test. Let me just try it. Where I'm 0 above the requirement, but that bag it's gonna hit you hard. Like a 0 against the same number is usually pretty bad odds for you when you pull that token. So you're better off drawing the card and ensuring that you're at least a little bit above that test when you take the test.
Yep, definitely good points. And like Nate Lost in Time and Space started off saying, you are going to lose sometimes. I think, having some patience, having a sense of humor, being like, well, hey, last time the rivers ran red with our blood. Let's see if we could maybe only bleed out half as much this time. I mean, one thing I think beginning players should know is that you will get frustrated. You will have a perfect plan start off great. You'll have a scenario start off great. And then all of a sudden, whereas one round you have 0 creatures, the next round you have every creature in the deck possible on you, But what I found from playing the game...
Ain't that the truth?
Yep. What I found from playing the game 3 to 4 times a week since it came out is that hopeless situations sometimes have hope. I have so many memories of pulling together with friends, or if I'm doing solo, of just sticking with it and doing my best. And you're going to get instant fail tokens pulled back to back. Sometimes you're going to get ridiculous resurges of success. And how did I solve that conundrum? Focus on learning the game when you play it. Focus on making less mistakes, which will help in the long run. And focus on being with your friends or just enjoying the flavor of the game, the ambiance. And don't be afraid to drop down, the easy level for a while. Or, if you really want to, if you just want to experience the story, make whatever house rules you want. It's a cooperative game meant for you to enjoy. There are no hard and fast rules that will stop you from doing that.
Well, if you want to talk about a guy that's all too familiar with pulling multiple tentacles at a time, it'd be Man from Lang. And